The bell over the diner door gave a tired jingle as another gust of cold November wind swept through, rattling the napkin holders and making the "open" sign sway like it wanted to give up. Maggie didn't even look up from the counter where she was refilling the sugar jars. At this hour, the only regular visitors were truckers running late or travelers who'd missed the highway exit. Her little diner, Maggie's Place, painted in peeling red letters on the window, had once been her father's pride. Now it was just her, the hiss of the coffee machine, and the lonely hum of the refrigerator. The man who entered that night didn't look like a customer. He lingered by the door, shoulders hunched, the smell of cold and dust clinging to his worn coat. His boots were cracked, the kind of cracks that came from miles of walking rather than a bad fashion choice. Maggie noticed his hands first, red, trembling slightly, as if they hadn't held warmth in days. He stood frozen near the threshold, as though he was debating whether he belonged there at all. "Evening," she called out, her voice breaking the silence. "You can sit wherever you like." He didn't move right away. His eyes darted around the empty booths, then settled on the counter where she stood polishing a chipped mug. I don't have much money," he said softly, almost apologetically. His voice carried that raw edge of exhaustion, the sound of someone who'd been turned away too many times. Maggie felt something twist inside her chest. She'd been raised on the kind of small-town decency that didn't ask for explanations before kindness. Her father used to say, "Feed the hungry first, worry about the bill later." It had stuck with her all these years, through droughts, through debts, through nights when she herself wasn't sure how she'd keep the lights on. "Well," she said with a small smile, wiping her hands on her apron, "you're in luck. Tonight's special is free for anyone who's had a rough day." For a moment, the man's expression flickered between disbelief and relief. He shuffled toward a stool at the counter, every movement slow, careful, as if afraid she might change her mind. When he finally sat down, his shoulders relaxed just enough for her to see how thin he was under that heavy coat. "Coffee?" she asked. He nodded quickly. "Please." She poured him a steaming cup, the smell of roasted beans filling the air. He wrapped his hands around the mug and closed his eyes, like he was holding something sacred. Maggie couldn't help but watch him. There was something about the way he sat there, quiet, almost invisible, that tugged at her. "Got some roast beef in the back," she said, trying to sound casual. "Mashed potatoes too. You'll eat, right?" He hesitated. "You don't have to." "I know," she interrupted gently. "But I want to." When she placed the plate in front of him, a generous portion of roast beef, steaming potatoes drizzled with gravy, and a few green beans for color, he stared at it for a long moment before picking up his fork. The first bite seemed to break something inside him. He ate slowly at first, then faster, the hunger taking over. Maggie turned away to give him privacy, pretending to wipe the counter though she was mostly just blinking back a strange, unexpected sting of tears. Outside, the wind howled against the window, the world beyond her diner dark and empty. Inside, there was warmth, the soft clatter of fork against plate, the hiss of the coffee maker refilling itself, the faint hum of an old country tune playing from the radio. When he finished, she brought over a slice of her apple pie, warm from the oven, with a scoop of melting vanilla ice cream on top. "Dessert's part of the deal," she said, setting it down before he could protest. He looked up at her. Then, really looked at her. His eyes were deep brown, tired but full of something that made her heart skip, a kind of gratitude that words could never carry. "You don't even know me," he said quietly. Maggie shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Hungry's hungry." He smiled, faintly. It's been a long time since anyone said that. She wanted to ask him about his story, where he came from, what had happened to bring him here to her lonely diner in the middle of nowhere, but she didn't. Sometimes people needed food more than they needed questions. So she just let him eat in peace. By the time he finished the pie, the diner clock was creeping past 9. He sat there for a moment, staring at the empty plate, then took a deep breath, as if trying to hold on to the warmth of this small, ordinary kindness. When he finally rose to leave, he nodded at her, his eyes shining in the dim light. "Thank you," he said softly. She smiled back. "Take care of yourself, all right." The bell jingled again as he stepped out into the cold night. Maggie watched through the window as his figure disappeared into the darkness, the sound of the wind swallowing him whole. Then she turned back to the counter, unaware that the night had just planted the seed of something that would soon change her life forever. When Maggie returned to clear the man's table, the diner had gone quiet again. The wind outside had softened to a low whistle, brushing against the windows like a lullaby. Only the flickering neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a pinkish glow across the checkered floor. She moved slowly, collecting the empty plate, the fork resting neatly beside it, the coffee mug drained to the last drop. Something about the way he'd left everything, tidy, deliberate, made her pause. Most people didn't bother cleaning up after themselves anymore. As she reached for the plate, she noticed something tucked beneath it. At first, she thought it was just a crumpled napkin, but when she lifted the dish, she saw it was a small piece of folded paper. It was worn, the edges slightly damp from the steam of the meal. She wiped her hands on her apron before unfolding it carefully. Inside, in neat, careful handwriting, were just a few lines. "You reminded me what kindness tastes like. I won't forget." Maggie blinked, reading it again. The words were simple, but something about them made her throat tighten. She felt a sudden wave of warmth spread through her chest, mixed with a strange melancholy. Whoever he was, he'd taken the time to say thank you, not with money, but with something that felt infinitely more valuable. Then she noticed what was sitting on the table beside the note. A small, golden coin. It gleamed faintly under the overhead light, its surface smooth yet old-looking, like something from another era. Maggie picked it up, turning it over between her fingers. It was heavier than it looked, solid, warm from where it had been resting against the plate. On one side was a design she didn't recognize, a tree with roots curling deep into the earth and branches stretching toward the sky. On the other side, faint engraved letters spelled out something she could barely read, Latin, maybe, or another language entirely. It didn't look like any regular coin. Not US currency, not foreign pocket change. It looked special. She turned it over again, studying the worn edges, wondering where on earth a man like him could have gotten something so beautiful. "Now where did you come from?" she murmured, half to herself. The wind rattled the door again, but the man was long gone, no trace of him except for that note and the coin that now sat gleaming in her palm. She looked out the window, expecting maybe to see a shadow, a figure walking down the empty road, but there was nothing but darkness, stretching endlessly in both directions. Her mind started to fill with questions. Was he homeless? A drifter? Maybe a veteran who'd lost his way? Or something else entirely? She thought about the way he'd looked at her before leaving. Grateful, yes, but also calm in a strange way, as if he knew something she didn't. The warmth from the diner suddenly felt too small for her thoughts. Maggie walked behind the counter and sat down on the stool where the man had been. She placed the coin on the counter and rested her chin in her hand, staring at it. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random act of gratitude. There was a story behind that coin, maybe even behind him. She picked up the note again and ran her thumb across the ink. "You reminded me what kindness tastes like." The phrase lingered in her mind, each word carrying a weight that didn't quite make sense yet. Maggie smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You sure know how to leave a mystery behind, don't you?" she whispered. Later that night, when she closed the diner, she locked the doors, turned off the lights, and slipped the coin into the pocket of her apron. It felt right to keep it close. Maybe as a reminder that kindness still meant something in a world that sometimes forgot how to be gentle. But as she drove home in her old pickup truck, the thought of that man wouldn't leave her. His eyes, dark and deep, like someone who had seen too much of life, kept flashing in her memory. The way he had thanked her, quietly, almost as if it pained him to speak. She wondered where he was sleeping that night. If he'd found shelter. If he'd eaten again. When she got home, she set the coin on her bedside table. Under the soft glow of the lamp, it shimmered faintly, catching the light in a way that made it look almost alive. She tried to fall asleep but couldn't shake the feeling that the night had been more than just an act of charity. It felt like a turning point. Small, quiet, invisible to the world, yet somehow deeply significant. The next morning, she carried the coin with her again. When she showed it to her cook, Joe, he frowned and said, "That's no ordinary trinket, Maggie. Looks old. Maybe real gold." But when she tried to look up the symbol later in her old encyclopedia, she couldn't find anything. It was as if the design didn't exist. For the next few days, she kept the note pinned behind the counter, right next to the register where the regulars could see it. A few of them smiled when they read it, others just nodded silently, understanding that sometimes kindness didn't need a reason. Still, every time the bell above the door jingled, Maggie found herself glancing up, half expecting him to return. But he never did. The road stretched on, the days rolled by, and the note and the coin became quiet fixtures in her little diner. What Maggie didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was that the man she'd fed that night hadn't left her world at all. He'd simply stepped out of sight, watching, waiting, and preparing something that would one day make her kindness echo far beyond the walls of that small, lonely diner. It was nearly 3 weeks later when the sleek black car appeared outside Maggie's place. The morning had started like any other. She'd come in early to brew the first pot of coffee, turned on the old jukebox for a bit of company, and opened the blinds to the weak winter sunlight. The usual crowd of locals had trickled in, old Mr. Benson reading his paper at the corner booth, a couple of truckers laughing over pancakes. Everything felt comfortably ordinary, until that car rolled up. It wasn't the kind of car that belonged on the cracked parking lot of a roadside diner. Polished, silent, and expensive, it looked like it had gotten lost on its way to a city boardroom. Maggie watched it through the window as it came to a smooth stop. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his shoes gleaming even under the dull light. He glanced around, then pushed open the diner door, setting off the little bell. The chatter died almost immediately. "Maggie Owens?" he asked, his voice formal but polite. She wiped her hands on her apron. "That's me," she said cautiously. "Something I can help you with?" He smiled faintly, reaching into his coat pocket. "My name's Daniel Brooks. I work for Mr. Jameson." The name meant nothing to her. "Should I know who that is?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am, but I believe he knows you." He handed her a large white envelope, the kind that looked too official to bring good news. Maggie frowned, taking it carefully. "What's this about?" "I was asked to deliver that personally," he said. "Mr. Jameson wanted you to have it." Maggie's first thought was that it must be a mistake. Maybe someone with her name had ordered something online, or it was a tax thing, though people in black cars usually didn't deliver IRS mail. The envelope felt heavy, like there was more than just paper inside. Daniel gave her a courteous nod. "I'll let you read it. I'll be waiting outside if you have questions." And with that, he turned and left, the bell jingling softly behind him. Maggie stood there for a long moment, the envelope in her hands, aware of every eye in the diner on her. "Go on, open it, Mr. Benson called from his booth, curiosity lighting up his wrinkled face. She smiled nervously and tore the seal. Inside was a letter, handwritten in the same neat, deliberate style she remembered from the note weeks before, and a thick folded document. Her heart skipped. She read the first few lines, and the world seemed to tilt slightly. "Dear Maggie, you may not remember me, but I will never forget the night you gave me a meal when I had nothing. You didn't ask who I was, or why I was there, you simply showed kindness. What you couldn't have known is that I wasn't who I seemed. I was lost, yes, but not in the way you thought. I had been searching for people who remembered what it means to care without reason. You reminded me." Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she kept reading. "Enclosed is the deed to a new venture I am starting, a chain of community cafes called The Open Table. Each one will serve those who cannot pay, supported by those who can. I would like you to be part of it, not just as an employee, but as a partner. Your name is on the documents. The first cafe will open here, in your diner, if you'll have it. The coin I left was a token from my grandfather, who built his fortune from nothing but honesty and generosity. He used to say that every act of kindness plants a tree that will outlive us. Consider this my way of watering that tree. A. Jameson." Maggie sat down before her knees could give out. The room blurred slightly. Mr. Benson had stood up, craning his neck to see the letter. "You all right, Maggie?" She laughed, a sound that came out half shaky, half disbelieving. I think that starving man I fed might have just bought me a business." The cook, Joe, leaned out from the kitchen doorway. "You're kidding. She shook her head, still staring at the letter. No, Joe, I'm not. When she unfolded the deed, she saw her name printed right there beside Elliot Jameson, founder. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was clear enough. She owned half of the Open Table Foundation. The diner, her diner, was to become the first of many places built on the same idea that had guided her father's hand decades ago: feed the hungry first, worry about the bill later. Tears welled in her eyes. For years, she'd scraped by, serving coffee to strangers, and hoping to keep her father's dream alive. Now, that small act of compassion, the one night she decided not to close her heart, had somehow rippled outward into something enormous. When she finally stepped outside to thank Daniel, he was leaning against the car, waiting patiently. "You met him, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Daniel smiled. "Yes, ma'am. And he told me to tell you this: some debts aren't meant to be repaid. They're meant to be passed on." Maggie pressed the letter against her chest, feeling the weight of both the words and the moment. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and the faint hum of the highway. She looked back at her little diner, the worn sign, the squeaky door, the cracked booths, and for the first time in years, she didn't see what it had been. She saw what it could become. When she walked back inside, the regulars were all waiting for her to speak. Maggie wiped her eyes, smiled, and said softly, "Looks like we're gonna start feeding a lot more people, folks." And just like that, the small, forgotten diner at the edge of a Kansas highway became the first spark of something bigger, proof that a single act of kindness could change not just one life, but many.